Hello and welcome to First Flight, a Star Trek Enterprise rewatch podcast where we are watching and discussing each episode of Enterprise in succession. First Flight is a proud member of the Tricorder Transmissions Network.
This is Commander Tucker of Enterprise. We've got some information you're going to want to hear.
Hello and welcome, Enterprise fans. I'm your co-host, Abby.
And I'm your co-host, Melanie.
And tonight we are discussing the last episode of Season 1, Shockwave Part 1. It was written by Rick Berman and Brannon Braga. It was directed by Alan Croker, and it first aired on May 22nd, 2002. But before we begin our discussion, we need to issue our read alert.
Tactical alert. All hands to stations.
There are potential spoilers ahead. We might end up talking about any part of the series at any time, so you have been warned. All right, and now for a summary of the episode, it's time for my captain's log.
Captain Starlog supplemental.
All right, here we go. Shockwave Part 1. After seeming to cause a terrible disaster, Enterprise is recalled to Earth when Daniel suddenly appears and informs Archer that the Suliban and the Temporal Cold War are involved. All right, let's get into this episode. Melanie, let's start with you. The beginning, it's quite the explosive start. What are your thoughts?
Oh, yes. Well, I find the cold open interesting because we're learning about a new society and get more information, and it's always exciting to do that. And yes, this explosion, so heavy, so sad. I mean, you obviously see it on Archer's face and how he's feeling afterwards, but that was really intense, really tense, and so well done the way they filmed it with the explosion while T'Pol was talking, and very just sad and heavy.
Yeah, I think this was an interesting one because it started out just like you think so many episodes do, like you said, with talking about we're going to go meet these people and giving you all the backstory and the plot exposition. And then it's really nothing like what you expected. There's a humongous explosion. And yeah, I think that this was a season finale. So you go in and expect it to be big, but this is a cold open that you don't forget because it literally is explosive. And one thing before we leave this very first part, I was wondering as they are sitting, Trip, T'Pol, and Archer are in having their little beverage and talking about all this. They're all drinking from the same pot of something. What do you think it was that they were drinking that all three of them would want? Is it one of T'Pol's teas? Because it's definitely not coffee. Like, T'Pol's not a coffee drinker. So I was just curious about that.
That is such a good question. Well, we know it's not passion fruit tea.
No.
Because T'Pol doesn't care for that. We have to know. I personally sometimes get anxiety from what I like to call misunderstanding episodes, not just in Star Trek, but with any TV, when there's a big misunderstanding and someone's to blame for something or someone thinks something is something else and it doesn't get resolved till later. And it just makes me uneasy. So I'm glad that in this one, it was cleared up fairly quickly. But on that note, you just feel so badly for everyone. I mean, 3,600 people when Hoshi says, the land is scorched.
Yeah.
That was so well done. I mean, my heart felt for Archer.
Yeah, that scene is really powerful because they're in sickbay. They're all talking everything over. Trip is knocked out. I mean, this is a big thing. And just to see it ping-ponging around, they're all trying to piece together what possibly could have happened. And they know each other so well at this point, and they're all being very professional. But the fact that they have so much emotion in their face, in their voices, in all of it, everybody knows how serious this is, and everybody's mind is spinning, not just about what happened here, but the repercussions. I mean, that immediately jumped into everybody's mind. T'Pol says so later. She knew as soon as she heard about this that the Vulcans were going to jump on it. So this was not far off of anybody's mind. So that leads us kind of into the next part where we have all these conversations with the different people and our different pairs and trios, and Archer talks to Forrest and all of that. And one of the things that I thought that was really interesting about this first kind of third of the episode, where it has that anxiety, like you were talking about, it's so much tension because we know as the audience, they didn't do this. And it's just watching them just feel sorry for themselves. But it's also that anxiety. You're right. And that stays that way. The whole call with Archer and Forrest is full of just that. They know this is not the worst of it all, that there's more coming because of this event. And it might be, not to say that the loss of the lives weren't worse, but they can see the 10 and 20 year setback coming. And that anxiety and that tension goes through there. And you see that in all these conversations in here. We see it when Trip comes into sickbay and is being grumpy at Phlox. And by the end, he realizes this is misplaced anger. But we see it when Trip is mad. And even T'Pol is affected when Archer's telling them that they've been canceled and recalled and all this. These conversations are so well done, and the emotion behind them. And when it changes from anxiety to just that intense disappointment and resignation, it's palpable. And because we've gotten to know these characters throughout this season, and because we have so many different groupings of these conversations, we really get that feeling carrying through nicely, and we see how it's affecting everyone. I mean, T'Pol even talks to Phlox about it. So that was just a really cool chunk for me of good character moments.
Well said. I completely agree. I like that they spent the time doing that with all the different combinations. And I actually did take a few notes about each conversation. Do you want to tackle them one by one for just briefly?
Awesome. Go for it. Start with your first one.
Okay, Phlox and T'Pol. I thought it was interesting. Well, let me back up for a moment from the previous scene that we were talking about. Chalk it up to T'Pol to say, let's not place blame right now. And I really liked that. Thank you, T'Pol, for that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Phlox and T'Pol. I thought it was interesting that they shot the scene from the middle, that you don't know who she's talking about, but obviously you figure it out quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And I took it as two different things. First of all, she cares about Archer at this point. They are friends. They have a relationship. So I think she's approaching it from, she's worried about him. But she's also, as first officer, she is doing the right thing, I think, to point out to Phlox that we should keep an eye on him. And, maybe fit for command is extreme, but I think she's doing what she thinks is right.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you said. And I feel like this just shows that one of the highlights of this series up to this point has been every conversation that Phlox and T'Pol have with each other. It is so interesting to have two aliens on this human ship, and their perspectives are always so unique and just that little bit different, that it serves to highlight all of the humanity that everybody else is displaying. And I just think that this is a pairing I wish they had explored more and often and more deeply, because they are gold together every time.
Yes.
So since we're talking about Phlox right now, let's talk about that conversation between Phlox and Trip. Like, that is one of those moments where you can see they have genuine emotion between them. There's genuine caring. They're both so in character. And, Trip needed somewhere to get this out. And Phlox was the right person because he understood what it was. He took zero offense, and he kind of snapped Trip out of it. And it's like, all right, you good? Let's move on. And I love that we saw him packing up his menagerie, because he has so many creatures in that sick bay. It would take him days to do it. And it's a nice little Phlox moment in there. And his assessment of humanity is so much more positive than theirs. I think Denobulans have been in space a little longer. He's got some perspective they don't. So it was a really nice conversation.
I agree. I really liked this scene. They were very real with each other, like you said, and Trip is so understandably upset. You're right. He has to let it out. My only thought is, I mean, I get where Trip is coming from because this is huge. The ramifications are huge. But when he said to Phlox, that drives me crazy, that part about you.
Yeah.
I just wanted him to do one little sorry, Doc, at the end. I know where Trip is coming from. I just wanted our beloved Trip to just do a little, instead of goodbye, Doc, or thanks, Doc, like, sorry, Doc. That's all I wanted, was a tiny bit of that. But it is a great, great scene. So how about Archer, Trip, and T'Pol in the scene where he lets them know that the mission's been canceled? What are your thoughts on that one?
Well, I like how we see Archer actually calling them to his ready room, because you can tell from the way that he walks out and gets them that this is not going to be a good conversation, and that my heart breaks for Archer having to say the words that he says. And so interesting when you watch the faces of Trip and T'Pol. Even T'Pol has a reaction, and we know that she expected this, but to see that tiny little like eyebrow quiver, and then right next to Trip's gigantic reaction, that, you know, there's their spectrum right there, and everybody else falls somewhere in between. But this is a conversation that would never have happened at the beginning of this season. It wouldn't have happened at the middle of this season. This is their relationship having gotten to a point where they really trust and understand each other, and they can be open and honest, but they also still have that respect, because at the end, when Archer dismisses them and he says, both of you, either one of them could have been the one that would have been staying behind to try to give him one more thing. So he made sure to let them know, I really don't want to talk to either one of you right now, because he knows one or the other of them was probably going to stay and do more. And that's a tiny little nuance, but it speaks so much to the big three and how in just one season they have grown this relationship to a point of deep understanding. And that's really neat to see, even if the scene itself is stupidly heartbreaking.
Yeah, I hear you. Again, well said. This is a fantastic scene. And let me just back up a little and say, in my opinion, this is a fantastic episode. And all of these scenes are one right on top of the other. Just keep it going with this high quality. And Archer is so defeated in this episode that when he says dismissed, the way he says dismissed, it's just heartbreaking.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you said there. And that's why it makes it so hard to watch. And speaking of hard to watch, the Archer Forrest conversation is also hard to watch. Like, when you think about a mentor and a mentee right here, and the disappointment is palpable from both of them. And when Archer is saying, you know, I should be the one to contact the homeworld and tell them, and Forrest is like, yeah, you should, but hold up on that. That's another deep friendship there, knowing that he is nowhere close to ready to talk to these people in any type of way that wouldn't be inappropriately emotional. So what a nice little scene. I love every bit of Admiral Forrest we get, but this was a particularly nice one. What did you think?
I 1000% agree. This is one of my favorite scenes of the episode, and it's one of my favorite Archer Forrest scenes. I think I watched it a few times. Let me say that you're right. The tension is palpable.
Yeah.
The support is palpable. The remorse is palpable. And this is one of the few times that Archer does call him sir. We've talked before about how informal they are sometimes. This time, the sir is warranted. And Forrest is saying all the right things. I like the way he's guiding him and keeping him focused. Like, you followed all the protocol. We'll take it one step at a time. You know, that type of thing. I really like what Forrest said to him. It was very, very well written. So I really like that scene. And I will say, just as a little personal aside, that when Archer said, I should be the one to tell them, which was so well acted, that moment. And you know, that's not a fun job. It totally, I used to be a school principal, and I've been in that position of having to tell people difficult things like that. And I have to tell you that flashed in my mind for a moment, because I could relate to that. Obviously, it's a much different level what he's going through, but I have to say that I did think of that. And that's our Archer. This was a fantastic scene. Okay, that brings us to Archer and to Paul. Archer's laying on his bed. Paul comes in to show him the EM signature. What are your thoughts on this one, Abby?
Okay, this one is one of my favorite of these conversations because I really appreciate the growth in both of them in just one season. When you think back to Broken Bow and think about how hostile they were to each other, and they get to the point here where T'Pol feels comfortable enough to ask him if he's just wallowing. Are you feeling sorry for yourself? And he says you're out of line, but it is not said with any hint of malice. He is saying it because he doesn't want to pursue the conversation, not because she's wrong or because he doesn't trust her to know him that way. And I appreciate so much throwing the water polo ball back and forth. I can have a deep emotional conversation, but I have to be doing something. Like he and Trip do that all the time in this series because that's how they process, by they're doing something physical too. And I appreciate that T'Pol, when she really wants him to pay attention, her voice level gets louder. She gets louder when she needs him to like stop, pay attention. This is the point of this conversation right here. And that's really nice to see. They're both playing this relationship to where it is now perfectly. And there's Porthos. So you can never go wrong with more Porthos.
Yeah, I hear you. To me, this scene shows how far down he really is, because when she mentions the EM signature, normally Archer would jump at any shred of anything that might lead to something, right? But he basically ignores that, and which is not in character for him. So I think it really shows that he's not even really listening. I mean, he's listening, but it doesn't faze him in the least. So I think it shows how down he really is.
Yeah.
And I love the line when he says, and I'm probably paraphrasing here, this is probably the first time that a Vulcan tried to cheer up a human. I love that line. So great scene. Now we can move on to the Daniels bringing Archer back in time. What are your thoughts?
Okay. First thing I have to say with this is said with nothing but love. But so he goes to bed in Enterprise. He's wearing his little Enterprise underwears, the tank top and the little shorts, right? And he's calling Porthos to come up in bed with him. He's like, Porthos, come. The light is off. He can't see. Porthos doesn't jump up. And he says, Porthos, come. And then he turns the light on. And he kind of doesn't realize any of the sensory input going on, that he's now suddenly shirtless and wearing pants and in completely different bedding. He's looking for Porthos. He kind of glances at his arm, but I'm sorry, if I was transported back in time, and I don't know what this feels like, obviously, but I think the first thing that would concern me is that I was way more naked than I was a second ago. And I was obviously in a different place. So it just cracks me up that he's worried about Porthos over everything else. But that's just me going, all right, logistics of time travel, which who knows? So besides that, which is nothing but silly. Okay. Besides that, okay, I love the temporal Cold War. That is, I would inject it straight into my veins if I could. I think it is such a cool concept. You've heard me talk about this. The first temporal Cold War episode is what really keyed me into Enterprise. So this is cool. Like, I love that Daniels shows up and he goes, hey, remember that temporal Cold War I told you about? And Archer replied with, it's kind of hard to forget. That's me. Like, that was exactly me going, yeah, it's hard to forget. Can we talk about this more? And I like the explanation. I like how he's hiding him in his own timeline, which is kind of clever. I like that Archer is slowly figuring everything out with him. And what drives me nuts, and I've thought this since the first time I saw it, is when Daniel says, okay, here's what you need to know. And then they cut. The scene is done. I'm like, what? no, I want the next 30 minutes where they were talking about the factions and where to find the stuff in his quarters and all. That's what I want. So that is not a criticism to the show at all, because it's obviously leaving me salivating for more of this kind of scene. So that is my biggest takeaway from this scene is, man, I wish it was about 5 minutes longer. What about you?
Abby, you crack me up. That is so funny about the lack of shirt.
Yes.
And remember in Broken Bow when they put Archer through the transporter for the first time, and when he goes through, he kind of like grasps his torso. If we had had one little tap of his chest, like, where's my shirt? Okay, so I'm just joking around with you. I love this scene too. It's so interesting. It's always interesting for me to see the backstory of, okay, this was Archer's apartment, and hearing him talk to Trip about the inspection pod that we're going to see that scene in Broken Bow. So that was super cool. And yeah, I love the temporal Cold War too. Of course, wish there had been more. So anything we get is great. This is juicy stuff. And then we find out later, even though they didn't show what you wanted them to show, we find out later that we're talking about quantum engineering and all of that. And Trip's like, what the hell? So I like this scene into the retrofitting and getting the beacon ready, and it wasn't us, Trip, and all of that stuff, all of the buildup to boarding the Suliban ship is all super well done, because the tension, the drama, the action in this episode just keeps going and going and going, and it's great.
Yeah, I think that you hit on a bunch of important stuff in there. And when Archer says that line that it wasn't us, Trip, it just sends chills down you. But then it's, oh my God, we've got to do this nearly impossible thing. And, a minute and a half later through the montage, he's talking about, there should only be 20 Suliban for us to deal with. And you watch their faces then and you're like, they're all like, 20, huh? Oh, sure, no problem. Piece of cake, at the afternoon walk in the park. But to see all of our crew come together and do all of their parts, and everybody's got something. And that's one of the reasons that I love episodes like this, when everybody has a piece, everybody has meaty stuff, meaty lines, emotions, stuff to do. And that's what all of this is. That's what the whole Suliban part is everybody getting their piece. And wow, that Suliban ship is so dang cool looking. Oh, it's such a Star Trek-y design. Like, it makes me think about some of the Vulcan shuttle designs that we see later in Discovery that are all geometric shapes. And thank you to our friend Caleb at Rogue Mogue for reminding me of that on his pod, because now I'm seeing them in Enterprise all over the place. And this Suliban ship is an excellent example. I mean, we know they're cell ships. They're like a honeycomb. They're all those, hexagonal design, but the inside is neat too. And the fact that their data disks are 3 that work in tandem, that's just cool. I have no idea if it would actually work practically, but it's really cool looking, and it's a neat idea to think, and just that little bit different, that it all feels so alien.
I agree. I love the way in the set design that all of Suliban stuff is Sulibani. I like that they have little nuances of it throughout the set, like even the little plasma emitter that they put on the shuttle pod had that shape. Yeah. And I love that. Regarding the 3 against 20, that was awesome. I was a little bit surprised that Archer only took 2 people for 3 against 20, but hey, they have the right stuff. And wasn't that whole sequence, like, it reminded me almost of like Mission Impossible or something.
Yeah.
They handled that beautifully with the tension and then being stuck with the docking clamp. Like, the whole retrieval of the discs was awesome, I thought.
Yeah, it felt like a caper movie, like a heist, like one of those Ocean's 11-y kind of thing where everybody's got a piece and you keep adding it in. And I think it was so neat to see that. And then when they actually end up getting swarmed by the Suliban later, and you see they're in formation kind of like that too. When you see them from far out, you can see they're making hexagons. So like, I wonder to myself, would a strategy, if they had enough of them, like thousands of these cell ships, could they all kind of shrink in together and completely surround another ship? Because dang, that's a strategy. So I'm sure that would have cost a lot in CGI.
That would be cool. It would kind of be like their version of the Tholian web, I guess.
Exactly.
Regarding the scene in the briefing room, just going to back up a little from what you said. When Archer says it wasn't us, Trip, and Trip does that little exhale.
Yeah.
That was really cool. I will say, though, that I think the death of these colonists, sorry to be a downer here, was the jumping off point to tell this story. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Because even though we're relieved that it wasn't us, there are still 3,600 people dead. And we don't really revisit that, which you can't because that's the jumping off for this story. So I do like the fact that at one point when Archer's looking over the manifest of the colonists who died, that was a really poignant moment. And I think, Abby, I saw Vulcan's script. It probably was the Vulcan database.
Yeah, I thought it looked like Vulcan too. And I thought, again, lovely little bit of continuity there because the reason they're visiting this place is because the Vulcans knew it existed. So I'm assuming that it came from the Vulcan database. And that's just neat that people think of that stuff all the way through.
Definitely. So now we have, Forrest is in the loop that things are looking up, but darn it, Silik's back.
Well, I have to say, I'm a little disappointed he called him Jonathan instead of John, like he likes to, because that's one of my favorite Silik moments.
You're right.
I like this. I like that Archer is willing to sacrifice himself. I like that there's the faith in the crew to just let this go. I like the back and forth thing. So I do wonder if Suliban minutes are the same as human minutes, because when he's telling Archer he has 5 minutes to get down there, and then Archer asks, what about the crew? And he says, oh, you have my word, and now you have 3.5 minutes. That was definitely not 30 seconds. So hopefully they're syncing their clocks. But I do enjoy Silik. I enjoy Silik's interactions with the crew. I enjoy him as a reoccurring character. I think he has interesting motivation, and the little scene he has with Future Guy is telling. Like he's being reminded that bad things happened to him when he didn't do this, so he's doing this no matter what. And that's powerful motivation for the bad guy in this.
Abby, we think alike. When Future Guy does say to him, you know what happened last time, like you just said, the look on his face, I took a note on that too. I mean, that was impactful through the makeup. And I agree with you about that 30 seconds. It felt more like 12 seconds to me. And that got me thinking, how does other aliens know what our minutes and hours and days mean? Do you know what I mean? So That's crossed my mind too. But it does not take away from the potency of this scene and how they ramp it up with, I thought he was smarter than this. And then they're targeting the warp core. I mean, that is definitely cliffhanger material there.
Yeah. So let's move into the cliffhanger then. I mean, holy bananas, is this a cliffhanger? And I remember this summer being long and going, oh, what are they going to do? How are they going to do this? There's so many things that could go wrong. And it was a long summer. And I think as someone who grew up and saw the Best of Both Worlds cliffhanger, remembers that summer, it wasn't quite that. But because we knew all the actors were coming back, and we didn't know that there was, contract stuff with Next Gen. But I think this is right behind. This was an awful cliffhanger, and awful in the best way, meaning I couldn't get it out of my head for the entire summer. And I know I'm a sucker for time travel, but I love that you could see these futuristic buildings. And I liked that you have Daniels in his futuristic kind of black Tubi suit as opposed to the uniform that he popped in on 10 months earlier. I like that his haircut changes with it. I'm not sure I want to go to his future barber, but I like that detail is in there. I like that we see Daniels affected. I like that he's shook by all this, because that's even more powerful. I mean, Archer being surprised that he walked off that turbolift. And you know what? I'm sorry. If my turbolift door opens and I see the post-apocalyptic landscape, I'm staying in the turbolift and going back where I came from. Like, did it disappear behind him as soon as the door opened? Because I would not have stepped out. I mean, I'm glad he did and all, but what a cliffhanger. And I just remember going, oh, and I still do. And I purposefully have not watched Shockwave Part 2 yet because I want this feeling to sit with me while we talk about all of our season ending stuff. And it still leaves me with that wonderfully delicious, unfinished story feeling where you cannot wait for the end. And that's nothing more that you could ask for in a cliffhanger.
I agree with you. This is a shocking cliffhanger. And when Daniel says to Archer all the time, portals are broken. Wow. If that isn't impactful, then you have that look on Archer's face. And when they discover that the destruction happened a long time ago, and you're thinking, how the heck are they going to get out of this one? This was a fantastic ending to a really great episode. And you have to love it when the last episode of a first season of a new show is this good.
I hear a dog barking. That can only mean one thing. It's time for our Porthos picks, our favorite parts of the episode. Melanie, let's start with you this time. What's your very favorite part of this episode?
My favorite part is just a quick moment. It's when Archer says to T'Pol, listen, I never thought this was possible, but I traveled through time. And I know that they're having this discussion about him really needing her to believe it and the Vulcan Science Directorate and all that. But this moment just stands alone as he has this look of wonder on his face. And I just think it's a beautiful moment because I think back to the Johnny Archer and this being his dream and what it would feel like if you actually did travel through time. I love the look on his face. And I just think it's a poignant, cool moment.
I couldn't agree more. And that segues kind of into what I was going to say. My Porthos pick for this one is how many people support Archer throughout this whole ordeal. And one of them is T'Pol in that scene where he says, I need you to believe me. And she just kind of does the little head nod. And that is so great. That's her support, the most that she can give, despite, the Vulcan Science Directorate. And when he says, oh, good for them, that's one of my favorite parts. But think about how many people go to bat for Archer in this. Forrest goes to bat for him. T'Pol's ready to go to her government. The little scene between Travis and Hoshi in the mess hall where they're talking about how they might be infamous after this. And Hoshi says, anyone who badmouths Captain Archer around me is going to get an earful in any language they want. This episode is full of people supporting him, believing in him. I mean, even Daniels believes in him enough to make him part of this temporal Cold War, even though he shouldn't be. And how wonderful is that after this first full season, we get an episode full of people pulling for our captain.
That's a really great point, Abby. He does get a lot of support in this episode. And I love that line from Hoshi about in any language. And we see it again when Archer steps, right before Archer steps in the turbo lift and he says to T'Pol, try to keep an open mind. And the way she says, I'll try.
Yep.
That's a nice moment also. So I agree. Lots of support for Archer. Very cool.
Accessing library computer data.
Well, here on First Flight, we love little bits of fun information about Enterprise. So it is time for some trivia. Melanie, what'd you dig up for us?
Okay. Enterprise was the first series to end a cliffhanger at the end of its first season. Now, we've seen other cliffhangers from other shows, but this was the first one to do it at the end of the first season. And I thought that was interesting. And I also wanted to mention that we know how heavily influenced the first season of Enterprise was by 9/11. And I think we can definitely see some shades and echoes of that in this particular episode.
Yeah, agreed. You can tell that this was written in that time for sure. And some of the visuals are direct callbacks. So awesome trivia. All right, I've got two for us tonight too. One of them is, for a short time, the writers of this episode thought about revealing the identity of Future Guy, but In the interim of the first and second seasons, Brannon Braga stated, and I quote, "It just seemed too soon and it didn't serve the story," unquote. So that's interesting because we still don't know, and it's decades later. And my second bit of trivia is in the scene where Archer and Reed are exploring the holographic device in Daniel's quarters. There's all sorts of future Federation ships, and we can see the Defiant class, the Intrepid class, the Excelsior class, and the Nova class, just to name a few. I'm going to go into the Klingons that Malcolm was hoping for, but just neat little bits of continuity that we love.
I love that. And oh my gosh, Abby, Malcolm was so disappointed. He really wanted that stuff. And I want to know who Future Guy is also. I'm sure you've heard the theory that some people think it was Archer.
Yep.
And I find that interesting.
Transfer of data is complete.
So now that we have discussed this one quite extensively, it is time for our Vulcans Verdict. I love the beautiful scenes in this, like we said, about the different 2s and 3s of our crew. Silic is back, the temporal Cold War, which is my favorite. And it's a crazy good setup for a mean but absolutely delicious cliffhanger that just makes you salivate for season 2. And I have to say, this is one of my favorite season enders across all of Star Trek. I really think it was powerful. So this one gets a 9.5 out of 10 grapplers for me. I really, really like this episode.
Nice. I'm right there with you. This was a top quality episode of the season for me. The high stakes, the tension, the writing, the acting, the action, the way it's constructed with the temporal Cold War stuff, all of the characterizations. This was a great one. And I kept debating between a 9 and a 9.5, but I settled on a 9.5. So it looks like we're going to end the season with a match.
That's cool.
My chronometer's running backwards, sir.
Incoming transmission.
You read my letter?
Well, one of our favorite things here at First Flight is to hear from all of you wonderful listeners out there. So Daniels has sent us back in the timeline to hear some of your feedback on Desert Crossing. So we have one here from our friend Monique, who's at Imzadi666422 on Twitter, and she also likes to communicate with us on some of our other platforms. But she says, Desert Crossing is one of my comforting episodes. Love the relationship and friendship between Archer and Trip, and this episode is all that. And my Porthos pick is the way that Archer takes Trip in his arm like you do a little or younger brother to protect him. Makes me tear up every time. And my yeah, I know, it kind of makes me go, oh, too. So thanks, Monique, for that one. And our next one is from our friend, I'm not sure if it's Aaliyah or Alea, but it's at Aaliyah Giselle. That's ALEAHGISELLE. And she said, I always laughed at how the symbol on that guy's chin looks like it was drawn on by a magic marker. Well, it probably was, but it's always seemed so weird to me. Ha ha ha. And you know what? Gotta love Enterprise for the practical effects they can do. And you know what? That was a funny chin tattoo. So bravo. And thanks, Leia, for chiming in for the first time.
Yeah, I really appreciated their feedback also. And that was funny about the chin tattoo. Definitely magic marker vibes. And I really hear what Monique is saying. And when she mentioned him taking Trip under his arm, I kind of forgot about that. So I want to go back and watch that because that is very sweet. Thanks to both of you.
And if you'd like to continue the discussion with us or share your Porthos pick or Grappler rating or any other thoughts, you can reach us at First Flight Pod on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Melanie, what's the best way to reach you?
You can reach me on Twitter at ShuttlePod2. That's TWO.
And the best place for me personally is at Abby M. Sommer on Twitter, and that's SOMMER. We want to thank you so much for spending this time with us, and we'll be back next time with an extra special Season 1 wrap-up bonanza.
Woohoo!
And as always, we leave you with this quote from Captain Jonathan Archer.
The most profound discoveries are not necessarily beyond that next star.
They're within us, woven into the threads that bind us, all of us, to each other.